Well, good evening, and welcome to the Convergence series. We have something a little different for you tonight. Dr. Joseph Bottum is here to talk to us today from the Cyber Ethics Institute here at DSU, and we've really enjoyed having Joseph here. I can tell you, I'm fortunate enough to be on his mailing list. Well, if you don't know Joseph, he's very, very prolific. He gives you a lot of homework. So don't get to know him too much if you don't want homework, because he'll send you something he wrote every day, and it's so interesting you have to read it. So I've got evening readings now, and I feel much, I'm not sure if I feel smarter when I talk to Joseph or dumber, quite honestly, but I appreciate his articles. I'm gonna read something here from a much, much better writer than I am, so it should be pretty good here. Joseph Bottum is one of the nation's most widely published thinkers, with work in journals from The Atlantic to The Washington Post. His name would be mandatory on any objective shortlist of public intellectuals in America. National Review declares for he is, according to the New York Times, a poet, a critic, and an essayist with a sideline in history and philosophy. A native of South Dakota, he has appeared on television programs from Meet the Press to the PBS NewsHour, and his books run from the childhood memoir, The Christmas Plains, to the acclaimed sociological study of American religion, An Anxious Age. Holding a PhD in philosophy, Bottum teaches cyber ethics at Dakota State University, where he directs the Classics Institute, a think tank that examines both the wondrous achievements and the terrifying intrusions of the computer revolution that has reshaped the human condition in recent years. Today's talk is going to be The Science Boldly Going Where We've Gone Before. Thank you, Joseph, for coming tonight.
Is that working? Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of the party? Is that? All right, I want to start our discussion this evening with a story, a little anecdote. Just this fall, only a semester ago, I came over to Dakota State to teach philosophy, set up this cyber ethical think tank called the Classics Institute, and generally put into play some thought about the implications of the computer revolution as it has played out over the past 40 years. The dean of the college, Dr. Jones, Dr. Griffiths, Dr. Hansen pushed along the idea, persuading the Board of Regents that the school needed this. A New York Times article just last week talked about a number of other technologically sophisticated schools that are beginning to explore the idea of teaching cyber ethics, which means that Dakota State is actually ahead of the curve as it forces some of these issues into our conversations as professors, intellectuals, computer scientists, writers, and concerned citizens. Of course, that sometimes seems to mean only that I am supposed to walk these halls like a low-rent version of Banquo's ghost, signaling doom, and warning that our computer labs are blithely daring, blithely looking on that which, as Macbeth suggested, might appall the devil. Anyway, shortly after I first came over here to the eastern part of the state last semester, I found myself in a meeting with some senior people in technological fields, directors of computer labs, explorers of artificial intelligence, people with their fingers, if not on the throat, then at least on the pulse of the nearby future. And in the chit-chat before that meeting began, I mentioned a fairly recent British study claiming that many young adults spend a third of their waking lives on electronic devices. These young people, age, say, 16 to 22, check their phones for messages, the study found, an average of 85 times a day. And that, even while they already have their devices set to beep or vibrate, notifying that they have a message. And in response, after I mentioned this study, one of those senior technology sophisticates, a director of a computer lab, said that this study might as well have been done with his own children. His kids constantly consult their phones and tablets, he said. Like smokers who have to sneak out for a cigarette in the middle of a meal, they can't even make it through a restaurant dinner without withdrawing from conversation to look for messages. They get grumpy, he said, if someone tries to stop them. I knew just what he meant, I answered. Other recent studies have pointed out that people in constant electronic communication become disturbed when cut off from their computerized contact. They display signs of irritability, anxiety, confusion, and even a general feeling of dread, the existential sense of unfocused threat and displacement. And these are, I pointed out, the classic symptoms of the psychological category of disease known as addiction. Those kids are addicted to their electronic devices. Now, in response, the computer guy said something that struck me as amazingly profound and telling about where we are intellectually and culturally at this moment. Here he was, a significant figure with a doctorate and weight behind his opinions, a man presumably trained in graduate school to thoughtful articulation. And when I suggested that his children were displaying the classic symptoms of addiction, he answered, profoundly and tellingly, I think, with this reply. He said, "So what? So what if the kids are addicted? What difference does it make? Why should I spend the least division of an hour worrying about such stuff?" Now, there are several ways we could take this. Perhaps he was just being morally obtuse and doesn't particularly care about his children, although I don't think that's likely. Or perhaps he was just looking for an odd way to close down the conversation, although the conversation did in fact go on for a while till the actual meeting finally started and the person running it glared at us to be quiet. But let's just suppose for a moment that this senior figure in the technology world genuinely meant what he said. The sheer fact of addiction is not, and ought not to be, worrying or bothersome. That is an amazing thought. A proposition that logically reaches up toward a fascinating set of necessary prior assumptions and logically reaches down toward an equally fascinating set of consequences and implications. As it happens, I think our computer expert is wrong, just on the facts. New studies of psychological damage from a relentless connectivity are starting to line up with the anecdotal evidence you've all seen and experienced. The cross-generational data are not yet complete, but we've got enough to suggest that in the aggregate, clear psychological deficits are resulting from our machine-enabled connectiveness. We have measurable amounts of the infantilizing of affect, depressed social skills, fetishism of the commercial commodity, dangerously indulged fantasies, especially through pornography, but also online posing and role-playing. A devaluation of actual life when compared with the constantly Instagrammed lives of others that seem so much more fun than our own. Body hatred and dysmorphia, and especially the overvaluing of the opinions and esteem of others as expressed through social media, which then mediates experience as though from your ice cream dessert to your dancing shoes, nothing is real unless you take a photo of it, post it online, and gather enough likes clicked on it. These dangers are only dangers, of course. They threaten the weak rather than the strong, and most kids are strong enough to survive. It is, I suggest, however, worth considering how much damage to the weak we are willing to accept in the name of empowering the strong. You want an easy solution to this stuff? Draconian, admittedly, but easy. Don't let your kids use computers till they're 17 or 18. Computers bend the mind through the mechanism of attention, so don't let your kids go online till they have already formed their neural pathways in the ways of adulthood. That was the solution of Steve Jobs and a surprising number of other seminal figures in the computer revolution. They wanted to protect their own children from the devices they themselves were becoming fabulously wealthy producing. But given that you're not going to do that, given that the culture isn't going to do that, given that as a culture we have already sped way past the moment where we might do that, there's not much to do except protect the weak as best we can. Besides, these actual facts about the psychological damage of connectivity are not really the point here. They're not exactly why Provost McKay asked me to speak a little at this We Are Rising event, touting new research and new thought here at Dakota State. Rather, Dr. McKay saw some recent writing that I had done for popular magazines and opinion journals back east, and he wanted me to point out the human condition now as we endure the ongoing computer revolution. So we need to jump back to our computer guy, jump back to that idea of so what? The claim that computer addiction doesn't matter. Now, let's set aside the fact that we are increasingly seeing that, by God, interconnectivity does matter psychologically and socially. Let's concentrate instead on what it would mean to think that addiction doesn't matter. We used to think, of course, that addiction was bad in itself because it was a derogation of the human. Since human being, our existence as physically embodied beings, has at its best a shape that is not reached by the alcoholic, by the heroin addict, by the chronic onanist, by the psychotic. Addiction was considered a flaw in what ought to be a fully realized adult, a grown-up, noble in reason, infinite in faculty, in action how like an angel, in apprehension how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. The rejection of the notion that addiction is per se wrong happens in part from the metastasizing of the concept of addiction in modern psychiatry, psychology, colonizing nearby ideas till everything starts to look like an addiction. But more to the point here, the mainstreaming of addiction is a small portion, a telling example, a synecdoche of the general diminishment of the human through which we are suffering at this moment, and suffering at a time when the computer revolution is bringing consequences that we have few resources to resist. A few weeks ago, I wrote about a new book on the science implied by the technology in the endless iterations of Star Trek since the 1960s. It was this that produced the title that Dr. McKay gave this little account of the research I've been doing since I came here to Dakota State. And I hope will prompt a discussion. I don't want to talk too long. I'd like us to all kind of join in and think about these things together. But I did consider this. However much Star Trek still furnishes and continues to furnish our cultural imagination, it is in the end 1960s hokum. Throughout all its incarnations, the human remains unchangeably human despite the changes of technology. In a 1960s era dominated by bonanza and gunsmoke, the showrunner Gene Roddenberry originally pitched the series to NBC as Wagon Train to the Stars. And something of that pioneer sense never went away. Space provides simply a larger backdrop against which to act out all the hackneyed old human dramas. To think much about technology today is to see perhaps that a different future is bearing down on us. We aren't likely to be human the way we now understand human nature once bioengineering gets up and running. You think that people with gills will be just people like you and me, unimportant in any fundamental way, they just happen to have gills and can breathe underwater? You think people with cybernetic limbs will be just regular folk who, purely coincidentally, can snatch up 1,000 pounds? You think people who can spend all day lost in the perfect fantasies of full sensory computer immersions will be just ordinary neighbors? For that matter, artificial intelligence in Star Trek appears a friendly monster, well-contained all in all, and a useful tool for human masters as they make their wagon trek to the stars. There are a few jars and baubles along the way, admittedly, technology run amok, but all in all, hardly anyone asks the powerful artificial intelligences how they enjoy being merely tools, bit players in a human drama. A 1960s sensibility like Gene Roddenberry's might have imagined that computers would respond that they liked being slaves just fine. Over 50 years later, as neural networks start to break down our old notions of robotics and artificial intelligence, it's possible to imagine that the cybernetic answer may prove very different indeed. Now, that future that is bearing down upon us is proceeding down four paths that we should point out. The first is the pharmacological, which is all of the medicines that have been produced to change brain chemistry. The second is the biotech work, particularly in terms of gene splitting and gene editing. The third is robotics, and the fourth is artificial intelligence. These do not necessarily have anything to do with one another. We could imagine a culture that had mastered the chemistry of pharmacology without mastering robotics. We could imagine a group of scientists who had developed artificial intelligence without knowing anything about gene splicing. And yet, somehow, they all seem to be working together, pushing in the same direction. This would be a mystery, except in the birth of the modern age, we saw exactly the same mystery. Max Weber, in his great account of this, of the birth of modernity, called these the elective affinities, borrowing a term from Goethe, which in turn Goethe had borrowed to describe a love interest in a novel, had borrowed from early chemistry. Elective affinities was an early name in chemistry for, the word is escaping me, the material that helps to other reaction take place but doesn't participate in the reaction itself is a catalyst. Elective affinities is an early name for catalysts. And Goethe borrowed it to describe a love affair in a novel, and then Max Weber borrows it from Goethe to talk about the paths down which modernity was born. The early modern project was born. And he pointed out that you don't get modernity, modern times, without Protestantism, the scientific revolution, the anti-royalist, democratic. He said these are elective affinities in the sense that they needn't work together. You can imagine one without the other. You can see that capitalist economics could be born, and nearly was born in Italy, in Renaissance Italy, without Protestantism. You can see, bureaucracy, which is another of his signs of the origin of modernity. You can see the bureaucracy of the nation state emerging without the democratic process and the rise of belief in democracy. They don't need to work together, and yet somehow they did. They all pushed in the same direction, out of the medieval, toward the birth of the modern. In exactly the same way, and by parallel, we have these four paths of the computer, of this latest scientific technological revolution, working like elective infinities and pushing down upon us, working together even though they needn't. Some of these I've grown less worried about over the last 20 years. Even 10 years ago, I would have been more worried about the biotech revolution than I am about the computer revolution. 20 years ago, I would have been much more worried about pharmacology than I am about the robotics. You remember 20 years ago, or many of you are too young, 20 years ago, there were all these books called Prozac Nation, Ritalin was in the news. This was all over the place, and we were all supposed to be worried about pharmacological movements and the giving of brain-altering drugs. That seems to have been brought under some control, and the advances have been, on the whole, slower over the past decade than they were 2 decades before that in pharmacology. The price we paid, of course, was the death of psychiatry. Pharmacology brought us enormous advances in psychiatry. The Freudian talking cure was suddenly given up on because you could give people drugs and just bypass years of therapy. In the same way, the biotech stuff 10 years ago was very much in my mind. 20 years ago was extremely in my mind. And the biotech revolution has not provided the cultural changes that some of us worried about at the time. It's pressing. And once we get an ability to bypass some of the narrow spots in the technology, for instance, the production of eggs, if you go to just about any college newspaper at a large college, the free newspaper nearby, you'll still see ads trying to pay college girls to have their eggs harvested. And that, of course, is for biological investigations. Once we're able to clone egg cells successfully, we're going to clear that narrowing point. Once we have the artificial womb, we're going to be able to clone, to pass another barrier. But on the whole, biotech, especially with cloning, got kind of oversold in 2000 because it hooked up with politics. One of the most demagogic moments in my lifetime was at the Democratic National Convention when John Edwards, who was the vice presidential nominee at the time, got up and pointed down on the floor at Christopher Reeve. Remember the actor Christopher Reeve, who was paralyzed? Pointed at him and said, "If John Kerry is elected president, that man will walk again." Because George Bush was going to stop stem cells. This was the idea. Stem cells just didn't deliver in any rapid time frame. And the threat of it, once it was removed from politics, the threat of it seems to have receded. In the decade since, robotics and artificial intelligence have leapt to the fore of my worries about the future. I think that we are in a kind of extraordinary situation. These will, again, grow together. I don't think we need to worry about Skynet and the possibility that somehow artificial intelligence is going to decide to exterminate us all. I just saw a video from Boston Robotics. Do any of you watch Boston Robotics' new videos? Of a pair of mechanical dogs opening doors for each other. Right? Again, though, it doesn't really worry me except insofar as there are military uses. It does strike me, and one of the speakers I'll be bringing in will be Heather Wilson, who's Secretary of the Air Force. It does strike me as dangerous when you arm artificial intelligences with directions to wipe out human populations. That strikes me as a recipe for disaster. But short of that, the robotics are probably not the real thing we have to worry about. What we're going to have to worry about is the union of this pharmacology, this biotech gene work, the robotics, and the artificial intelligence, in which the human is left behind, and we are incorporating this technology into our bodies. Scott McKay and I were just talking about the tech firm that was paying employees to embed a chip in the flesh under their thumb here, between their thumb and the web here, so that they could just hold up their hands to get access to electronic locks and have their pay stubs and everything stored in a little chip inside their bodies. This is the next step. Again, what happens when we have chips in our heads? And the human experience, which once upon a time we thought the pinnacle of creation, the very paragon of animals, when we have chips in our head that are mediating the world the way Google Maps mediates the world for you through your cell phone. Already, I've had the experience of getting somewhere and not knowing where I am, but being there, because I just followed the directions that said, turn left in 500 feet. And in the end, I was lost and yet there. I lacked placidness. I lacked the human in some important way. Now, what's the pressure for all of this? And this will be my last point before we really get some discussion going. The pressure for all of this is that much of it seems good. The Baconian project is being fulfilled. I deliberately went back to the birth of the modern. As Francis Bacon is one of those, he's a second-rate philosopher, but he's enormously influential because he's one of the hinges on which the door to modern times opens. And he looks at the world and he says, death is an outrage. Suffering is obscene. These are things that we must eradicate, and if we cease to be human in the course of eradicating them, then good is the consequence here. Now, that's a retreat. It's a retreat that no one imagined at the time of Francis Bacon we would achieve, but it's a retreat from the human. It's a retreat from our embodied experience, which says that we are thrown into this world at birth, every single one of us, and we will be removed from it at death. Every single person in this room will die. That is our embodiment as human. And if the human has a shape, then it must incorporate that. Francis Bacon would have said, if we could bring him here and force him to rewrite the new organon in modern English, he would say, let's stop being human. Let's get it on. Let's go forward from this. This pathway, these four pathways and they're merging together, become the fulfillment of Francis Bacon's vision. He wants to end death. He wants to cease suffering. When John Donne replies, the poet John Donne in his 16th of Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, this is the famous devotion, that no man is an island, that one. He says in it, affliction is a treasure and scarce any man hath enough of it. And that is the line, of course, that Bacon is opposed to. This idea that there's something human about our suffering. There's something human about being born. There's something human about dying. And Bacon is just outraged by it. These pathways of the future that are bearing down upon us are the possibility of fulfilling Francis Bacon's vision of what it is that science was going to do for us. Maybe it won't happen. There's a certain resilience in the human that I want to place my money on. But we also want to consider that even for its high-tech proponents, nothing in this world comes without disadvantages. There are no pure goods. Everything gets twisted by the timber that it is to be human, as Kant once said. And that, I think, is a principle that one might take to think about whether we should do this stuff. I have a formula I've used, which is the flagship is not the fleet. In any new technology, the best usage, the one that they sell us the technology in the name of, will not actually prove to be what everybody uses it for once they get a hold of it. We can see this in a lot of ways, but here's an example. David Frum once had a funny line. He said, the writer David Frum, he said, we actually have a name for the sexual revolution when it passes out of the hands of the mostly upper middle class 1960s college students and into the lower classes in general population in the 1970s. We call it disco. Now, that's a cruel joke and it's not entirely accurate, but the point of it is worth considering. No technology, no cultural change will endure in its original form, particularly if its original form is high and noble and wonderful, once everybody gets a hold of it. If we have fully immersive technology which vibrates the bones in the ear structure in order to create a simulacrum of sight for the optic nerves, we have allowed the blind to see, and Francis Bacon is our prophet. But once we have that technology and everybody's using it, it's going to get used for porn and cat videos, right? Because the flagship is never the fleet. The best use, the high moral use that we get sold a new technology on will not be the use once everybody gets a hold of it. that, I think, is an argument in part that the Baconian future that seems to be promised by these new technologies proceeding down these four paths will provide the same old human problems because we're human. And yet, will we be? As I say, and as I want you to consider, I'm not sure that we're human if we can snatch up 1,000 pounds. I'm not sure that we're human if we have gills, if we've been bioengineered to have gills. I'm not sure that we're human if we have a permanently attached chip in our head acting as face recognition software and memory joggers. I'm not sure that we're human if our arms and our legs have become robotic instruments of an entirely plastic will. Thank you. Now, I'd like, this was Scott, I think, wanted us to have some time for questions and answers, unless I have bludgeoned you all into silence. Yeah.
Going back to AI, do you see the companies like Google and YouTube kind of pushing that field forward with their algorithms to deliver people ads?
They have uses for it, absolutely. Of course, the biggest investor right now we have people who work in these fields and could answer more competently than I, but the biggest investor right now in artificial intelligence is the Chinese military, which is spending tons of money developing this. China has overtaken the US, or briefly managed to overtake the US in total flops of supercomputing. And I believe the United States is going to, or has just surpassed them again. But you have to understand, for those of us of a certain age, that's unimaginable. The United States was so far ahead that it seemed there were periods in my lifetime where we had, cray supercomputers, and the United States had more flops, more computing power than all the rest of the world combined. So it's shocking that a nation would surpass the United States. Now, as I say, the United States is supposed to retake the lead at some point, but it's still an amazing change. And the artificial intelligence parts of it are being strongly invested in by the Chinese military, which gives us two problems. First of all, they are an arm of the communist government, of the Central Communist Committee, which is looking for cultural control, social control. That's why the police want face recognition software, so that they can identify the protesters. But the second thing is the Chinese military has passed through, the People's Red Army has passed through some periods and may eventually arrive at a point at which its ownership of stock shares around the world is so large that it would be the world's first self-financed army. Not actually financially under the control of the government of China. That strikes me as a very dangerous and odd entity to give this power to. But they're the people who are investing in it, and it's really quite interesting to watch. Now, why do we want it? This is what, Google wants it, right? And they're investing in it, and there's a race to try and get this. It seems to me that in my generation, we grew up with an understanding of a distinction between, or with an idea of AI that would be based on things like distinguishing strong AI from weak AI. These were 1950s science fiction categories that the computer revolution picked up. And one, strong AI would be something that was actually self-conscious. Weak AI would be something that could fake self-consciousness. So ELIZA, the psychiatrist program, would be an example of weak AI. If you couldn't tell that you were not talking to a computer, if you had a conversation and you couldn't tell if it was a computer or a real human being, then that was weak AI. Strong AI would be if it manifested certain further signs of personality and self-consciousness. The thing about neural networks and the transformations that have happened in the last 15 years with neural networks is it's simply skipped over all of that. All those old distinctions we used to worry about what would happen when computers became self-conscious, the day that Skynet woke up. That was the formula, remember, in the Terminator movies, that it woke up. That's that old sense of strong AI as self-conscious. neural networks have just jumped right past it. It doesn't matter if in any philosophical or psychological or sociological way the computer program is self-conscious, because it's going to fake it perfectly. Right? That's what neural networks do. And every mistake it makes becomes grist for its correction. It doesn't have to be self-conscious. It will just be the perfect imitator of self-consciousness. And that jumps over all of those old AI distinctions, just races right past them. Neural networks are an extraordinarily powerful device that are actually far more threatening than the old Skynet stuff. Mostly because I think in this context, nobody knows how they work. I mean, we know in principle, in theory, at the theoretical level, how a neural network works. But when a neural network solves a problem, we do not know the algorithm by which it solved the problem. And if we did, it would have to be a trivial algorithm, any significant algorithm. The example I've been using to talk about this stuff on some of the radio interviews that I've been giving in recent months is the Alpha Pro Go program that I think Google certainly invested in it. I'm not sure who the owners of it are. Go, do you know Go, the game of Go? It's a Chinese game, very popular in Japan, where you put little white and black stones on intersecting lines on a square table. Some years ago, 5, 6, 10 years ago, the Alpha Pro invented and developed a computer to play Go that was basically the same principle as the Big Blue computer that defeated the world chess champion back in the 90s, right? Which was amazingly powerful computing. You had, Big Blue had one chip for each of the 64 squares on the chessboard, and another master chip, and a huge database of opening moves to save it time. And each chip would be working on what would be the best move to my square. And then the master chip would choose among them with its algorithms, and it would save time by basically having a library of all known chess games. And it managed to beat Garry Kasparov, who was the world chess champion at the time. The Go program that beat the current world champion, Go is one of the protected arts under the emperor in Japan, so there's along with the tea ceremony and sumo wrestling, and the Go program 5-10 years ago beat the reigning world champion on this model of just kind of brute force computing. Last year, they developed and applied this year, I guess in 2017, a new program to play Go, a neural network. Right? Lots of computing power, but they gave it the rules of Go, and they let it play Go against itself. And it played 1 billion games against itself in 2 weeks, whereupon they matched the new neural network program against the old world program, the hard brute force hardware program that had beaten the best human player. And the new neural network program beat the mechanical program 100 games to 0. And remember that hardware-based mechanical program was already the best Go player in the world. When asked about it, the spokesman from the Google consortium that had worked on this said literally, we don't have a clue how it works. We just let it play against itself 1 billion times. And it learned from its mistakes. That's what neural networks are doing. They're what's going to change AI. What you have to think is what's going to happen when a neural network of that kind of power gets truly loose on the stock market? What's going to happen when a neural network of that kind of power gets truly loose on combat in the military, flying drones? And if if it makes a mistake, who do we blame? These are not moral agents, after all. You can't put them in jail. They just learn from their mistakes. So this is why I've grown increasingly worried about AI. As I say, not in the old Skynet waking up sense, but in the sense that these neural networks are simply bypassing all the old stuff that we thought we knew, we who are old. Well, that's not going to happen. That's my point. Yeah. No, but it does strike me that we can be a lot more self-aware as we proceed down these paths. I was at a meeting of some computer people in October or November, and someone mentioned that the FBI was asking around to get a contract to do some work that would use neural networks to predict criminal behavior. Okay? And I thought, why isn't everyone in this room standing up screaming? Right? What is going on that we can, that the response of people would be, ooh, that's cool. Now I know why, because it is cool. It's technologically really cool. But we need to be carrying some suspicion here. These suspicions I've been trying to formulate in these new rules of cyber ethics, which are not even actually at the level of ethics. They're more like the metaphysics, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, as Kant would say. They're these first level principles before you ever get to an ethics. But this is that principle that, for instance, the flagship's not the fleet. This is a principle I formulated as the virtual is not the real. And we make a consistent mistake when we imagine that they are. This is a principle I formulated, these laws. I'm working on a good piece, I think, for the New Atlantis, which is a major technology journal, in which I want to argue these principles, another one of which is, I actually like the formula of the glory of the internet is that it allows like-minded people to find one another. The horror of the internet is that it allows like-minded people to find one another. We have a connectivity here at such a level that, you can see real gains. In my lifetime, here's an example of what the web gave us through its connectivity. Baseball cards, when I was young, were an opaque market. In classic economic terms, they were an opaque market. You never knew what they were charging for baseball cards in New York or Chicago. People were selling Honus Wagner #1 cards at garage sales for 50 cents. The market was completely opaque. There were books published, but by the time you got the book, they were already out of date. Coin collecting had much the same problem, stamp collecting. These were opaque markets. Right? Used books were an opaque market. You never knew when I would stop in every used bookstore I passed because you never knew when that book you were looking for was going to be on sale for 50 cents. Suddenly, the web changes all that. The reason you don't hear about baseball cards much anymore, these sudden stashes, is because the market is now perfectly transparent in economic terms. And the web made it so. Everybody knows what that card is worth. Everybody knows what this set is worth. Everybody knows what Papua New Guinean 1-penny black stamp is worth. The markets have become perfectly transparent. They are a model of what modern capitalist economists would call a market. Just beautiful. And that happened because all of the baseball card collectors could find each other on the web. At the same time, the web allowed pedophiles, Nazis, and radical bomb makers to find one another. They have, I argued in the Weekly Standard last fall, they have used the internet to drive their rage, all of them, left or right. Cass Sunstein had a brilliant piece back in 1999, sociological study that I was utterly convinced by, given the numbers that he used, in which he pointed out that in any conversation among a group of people all on one side of an issue, at the end of the conversation, everyone will have shifted further toward the side they support. So if we take a bunch of conservatives and they're talking about gun control, you'll have some moderates, you'll have some sensible middle types, you'll have some extremists. After they're done talking, they will have all become more gun control. Or more opposed to gun control. If you take people who are opposed to President Trump, some of them will be strongly opposed, some of them will be weakly opposed. If they talk only with one another, By the end of their conversation, they will have all shifted down the scale. The moderates will become strong, the strong will become extreme, and the extreme will become fanatics. It's a really fascinating sociological study demonstrated, through good numbers, that brings us a point of René Girard's, the French anthropologist and literary critic, who points out that we share these desires. We have a mimetic relationship with one another, and this stuff happens. The internet, particularly in its strangely closed communities, has provided echo chambers whereby this process that Sunstein demonstrated out of theoretical work by René Girard has all been proven to be true. Right? You can see it happening in real time as the anarchists get more anarchical, the conservatives get more conservative. The internet is drifting us apart, even while I'm old enough to remember when the first libertarian users came out of Arapanet, which was the military birthplace of what became the internet. And they were convinced out there in their garages in Northern California that the internet was going to set us all free. We were finally going to have perfectly free communication outside of all government control. We would hear all sides of everything. And of course, the internet turns out not to be that. Does that help, Dick?
Yeah. I'm just really concerned about the inevitability of the emergence of these technologies.
Right. Well, at each point, it seems to me if we apply some principles of suspicion, that we can resist some of this. And ultimately, of course, what I want to say is insist on the human. Again and again. Years ago, I was teaching a logic class, Dick, and we were doing, informal logical devices. When you're a philosopher, you always get stuck doing a logic class. It doesn't matter that your specialty is medieval metaphysics. Somebody like Dean Jones says you got to do a logic class because it's philosophy. So I was doing this logic class. We were teaching a class on informal logical devices, right? And I showed them infinite regress and how if you can show that an argument ultimately devolves down to an infinite regress and you never arrive at the first premise, it's an invalid argument. And one of the students said, I was teaching at this engineering college in Massachusetts while I was getting my graduate degree, and the student says, why? Why can't we follow it out to infinity? And I said, well, if nothing else is going to convince you, you're going to die, right? We are finite. If nothing else will convince you of human finitude, death is going to do that. And, and I felt sort of bad, but I said, this doesn't come as a surprise to anybody, I said to the class, right? Everybody knows that you're going to die, that you and I will surely die and never live again. And the only alternative to dying young is living long enough to bury your parents, because it is human to die. And this kid, this engineering student, good kid, maybe not the smartest kid, but serious, a morally serious kid. He raises his hand kind of tentatively, and he says, as though he were bringing into speech a thought for the first time, a thought he had always had but never expressed before. And he said, as though he were working it out, I'm not going to die, because by the time that I get old enough to die, medical science is going to have cured whatever it is that I was going to die of. And I remember thinking, when you do find out that you're going to die, the agony of that is going to be overwhelming. The desire for revenge, the desire for blame. There must be somebody to blame because I wasn't supposed to die. And that, in fact, that's not just intellectually problematic, it's morally problematic when you think that you are not bound to death the way we all are. In exactly the same way, it seems to me we need to resist those for whom these pathways of science merging together as elective infinities of technological progress. Those who feel them as though they were going to create a bright and perfect future, because they will not.
Like Dick was saying, isn't that the problem is, even though these pillars can exist on their own, there's a synergistic effect versus, you were talking about Dolly, right? When Dolly came out, the clone machines, there was a big ethics outrage. I think it slowed down that movement, right? But now, with the technological, you can't really control the message anymore like you could for so long.
Well, I don't think we controlled the biotech message. I mean, you know, the biotech stuff, especially cloning, was wrapped up in politics. Ultimately, it was the hedge issue, the ersatz issue, by which abortion was debated in that election. You know, I mean, nobody was saying abortion, but they were talking about cloning and embryos. And, you know, it all got politically charged and weird, but there was plenty going on. The French cloning company Clonade announced in, I think, 2001, 2002, that they were opening a laboratory. They were going to avoid the regulations of France and open a laboratory in the Ivory Coast in order, and they didn't say in order to avoid the regulations of France. They said in response to the great demand for cloning in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the cynicism of that was kind of overwhelming at the time, but it was proof that we wanted, and the culture wanted, cloning to produce amazing cures. And the simple fact of the matter is, embryonic stem cells have not yet produced a single verifiable cure. We've had some cloning cures, but they came out of adult stem cell cloning. And umbilical cord blood and some of the other sources for these stem cells, which is, you know, interesting. But I actually think that, that embryonic stem cell research can lead to some amazing stuff. I'm morally opposed to it because I want to protect the embryo, but I still believe that it could lead to some amazing stuff. But the simple fact of the matter is, back in 2000, it got oversold because it was all political. Undersold in some ways, oversold in others. And when the researcher in Japan, whose name is escaping me, and the one in Michigan, the two guys who did the, independently did the adult stem cell breakthrough in about 2005, 2006, their names are escaping me. Anyway, it sort of just washed that issue out of the public eye, the embryonic stem cell issue. But, you know, cloning is not a perfected technology yet. Dolly the sheep died of cancer. And it's just not a perfected technology. Will we get there? Maybe. But they are all working together. Synergy, I don't know. I mean, I'm always suspicious of that word. Terry Pratchett, do you know the novelist Terry Pratchett, comic British science fiction novelist? He's part of that camp with like Tom Holt and Douglas Adams, this group of British writers of comic science fiction. He wrote the Flat World books. He once described a salesman as someone who used words the way a pimp uses prostitutes to send them out on the street. He said, on the other hand, the word synergy was probably always a prostitute, which is a sort of cruel line. But, you know, synergy here is a hard thing. But that's why I chose not synergy, but elective affinities. Now, there are some connections in the birth of modernity, as, for instance, bureaucracy which is one of the paths by which the modern is born, bureaucracy requires expanded literacy. And you get expanded literacy out of the Protestant cult of Bible reading. So that, you know, there's a way you can imagine them growing together synergistically. But Weber's point is every single one of these you could imagine without the other. There's no logical necessity for each of these, for the scientific revolution, for capitalism, which, you know, remember Weber turns Marx on his head. Marx said, capitalism created the Protestant Reformation because they couldn't live with the old medieval system anymore. And Weber turns it on his head in the spirit capitalism and the Protestant ethic, and says, no, it's the exact opposite way around, right? Protestantism caused capitalism. It taught people these new virtues, which then allowed the democratic state to emerge, or the capitalist state to emerge. Regardless, yeah, they grow together synergistically, but they're not logically connected. You could have one without the other. And yet somehow our experience, am I wrong about this? Our experiences, they're all pushing in the same direction. Right? The biotech, the pharmacological, the robotic, and the artificial intelligence, it's all pushing us down this one way, which at certain points we need to resist and say, you know, let's think about the bad consequences of this new technology when it isn't just making the blind to see, but it's letting teenage boys put themselves in sensory deprivation chambers and experience porn. Right? Let's think about this new technology when it gets shared by everybody. Let's think about this new technology when we consider the way that it prompts us to imagine that what is actually virtual is real, as with our GPS stuff. Let's think about this new technology. Let's be suspicious of it, and let's maintain, as best we can, the essence and the sense that to be human is to be this thing, this mortal body, this mortal coil.